We're now in what's called the Passion narrative. It's the section it's in each of the Gospels, but the section of Matthew's Gospel that runs from Jesus' arrest to his death. So from last week, we've skipped forward a couple of days in the narrative. That's all. There's a lot happened. We're now late in the evening of the Passover. Jesus has just a few hours ago celebrated his Last Supper, the Passover feast with his disciples. And then they moved to Gethsemane, where Jesus spent probably 3 hours in anguished prayer. And we're now about to enter the final part of his life. The finale which everything has been working towards. And it begins today with Jesus being arrested. And one of the challenges, I guess, about reading or listening to passages like this is that it's very easy to make the main characters into very two-dimensional characters. They're either good or they're bad. They're either evil or they're holy. Makes for a good story when everything is black and white. But as we all know, life is rarely black and white, isn't it? Life comes with shades of grey. People are more complex than that. You and I are more complex than that. We're in Lent. Lent is, amongst other things, it's time for giving up things, I guess, but it's a season in which we determine to recognize and tell the truth about who we are. To recognize that complexity. To acknowledge that 1 minute we are capable of great selfless acts, and the next we succumb to petty-minded selfishness. So frustrating, isn't it? We do something great 1 minute, and the next minute we act like a complete beep. We are frequently contradictory, driven by a complex cocktail of motives. Some we're aware of, others we're not. A hodgepodge of faith and fear, of generosity and greed, of hope and despair, driven sometimes by things we don't completely understand. And yet in the midst of it all, seeking to follow Jesus. And the disciples were no different. Just like us. So what are we to make of Judas? Sorry, that was the previous slide. What are we to make of Judas? Do we make him into the typical villain? The bad guy who did it for the money? 30 pieces of silver, a deal with the priests, a kiss, job done, we move on. Of course, it might be that simple. Greed is a powerful emotion, isn't it? We all know that. But let's dig a little bit more into Judas. From the evidence we have, it seems most likely that Judas was a zealot. Just like Simon, another one of Jesus' disciples. The zealots, I guess today, would be called freedom fighters. At least if you were sympathetic to their aims, you call them freedom fighters. Otherwise, they were terrorists. They were a group who were committed to the violent overthrow of Rome, or at least of Roman occupation. A free Judah. Show my age again. Do you remember the old TV series, Freedom for Tooting? With, I can't remember what his name. Wolfie, that was it, Wolfie. Freedom for Tooting. This was freedom for Judah, only they were a bit more violent than Wolfie was. There's even a suggestion that Judas was a member of a extremist wing. He was part of the extremist wing of the Zealots, a group of assassins known as the Sicarii. We're not sure, but there's a possibility. If you mix that in with the conviction that the Jewish people had that God was going to send them a savior, a Messiah, who would free them, who would set them free from Roman rule, from all who oppressed them, who would establish his throne in Jerusalem and rule the world from there. And you put that together with the Zealots, and you put that together with the fact that this is Passover, the time when Israel gathered to celebrate God's liberation from when they were slaves in Egypt, where God set them free. It's quite a mix, isn't it? You can imagine the atmosphere maybe that was in the town, in the city. Those who longed for liberation. Those who longed for the world to be put right. And the powers that be nervous about what was going to happen next. It's a powder cake waiting to psh. I tell you that partly to set the scene. I've got out of sync on my slides. Partly to set the scene. But partly also to remind us that for many Jews, including some, maybe most of Jesus' disciples, they were locked into that idea of a violent Messiah. A Messiah who would defeat his enemies militarily. And it doesn't seem to matter how much Jesus talked about loving enemies or turning the other cheek. The disciples were as deaf as we often are. They just assumed that everything would get violent. It was the only way. Perhaps Judas was motivated by greed. Perhaps he was simply disillusioned with Jesus. He thought that Jesus was the guy. He was the one who would do this. And Jesus refuses to play ball. Jesus refuses to play that role. Judas loved his country. He loved his people. He longed for them to be free. And Jesus had failed. And Jesus had let him down. And he was angry. And if he could get rid of Jesus and maybe make a bit of money on the side, so be it. Brian Zahnd is an author I found really helpful the last few years. I'm reading this book during Lent. It's called The Wood Between the Worlds, looking at Easter, looking at the meaning of Easter. And if you're looking for something to read during Lent, I recommend that book to you. Anyway, in a recent sermon that Zahnd preached on this passage, I found it interesting. He suggested that actually what Judas was doing here was trying to force Jesus' hand. Remember all that heady expectation that this is the moment. That this is the moment that God is going to act, that the Messiah has come. He's trying to create that moment where Jesus has no choice but to react. Jesus' only option is the sword. He's not trying to betray Jesus so much as trying to manipulate him. From Judas' perspective, Jesus is the best bet they've got. He just needs a push, just needs some encouragement. Judas, in this reading, is trying to manipulate Jesus. He wants Jesus to serve his agenda rather than the other way around. And when it all goes wrong, Judas despairs and kills himself. Charlie has the joy of preaching on Judas killing himself in a couple of weeks. But it sounds more to me like the act of a failed revolutionary more than a petty thief. Of course, it's all supposition, really. We don't know whether Judas was motivated by greed, by disillusionment, by manipulation, maybe a mixture, maybe something else, all together. It strikes me that we're not immune from any of those, are we? Self-interest, tick. Disillusionment with Jesus or being disappointed with Jesus. I followed Jesus faithfully for many years, and now he's let this happen to me. How could he? Why me? Ever felt like that? I know pastorally I've spoken to people that feel like that. Somehow let down that things didn't turn out the way they wanted. Even that attempt to manipulate or control Jesus, to recruit Jesus for my cause, for my interest. Happens a lot in politics, doesn't it? A large chunk of the population have a deep religious belief that God is on our side, that we are special, that our flourishing is tied up with God's purpose, let's say. Peter Story, a South African bishop during the time of apartheid, said that no oppressive regime can survive without some kind of religious sanction. Think of Putin and the Orthodox Church in Russia. Dare I say it, think of America today. God is on our side. Let's read on for a moment. Suddenly one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. I do wish sometimes the Bible would tell us about the motivations of people. Why? Why did he do it? Was it fear? Would make sense, wouldn't it? He's afraid. What's happening? And when we're afraid, we can often lash out, can't we? I know I do. Or does this disciple share Judas's viewpoint? This is the moment. Vive la revolution. We don't know. And Jesus' response, just stop. Stop the violence. Put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? My kingdom, he says, is not going to come on the back of a sword, or chariots, or missile launchers, or F-16 fighter jets, or some dazzling display of military might. That is not how God's kingdom comes. It only ever leads to never-ending circles of tit-for-tat violence. We see that in the world, don't we? One act of violence begets another and another and another, and then everybody gets violent. Our King wins his kingdom by dying, not by being killed, by sacrificial death, not by bloody conflict. Christ's revolution, the revolution that conquers sin and death, comes through the cross, through sacrificial love. Somebody said the crucifixion is Christ's coronation as King of Kings. But it's also the way that God rules the world. Christ's kingdom is cruciform. It's shaped like a cross. And as citizens of that kingdom, we make Jesus known by love, by humble service, but not by violence. I imagine Jesus saying to disciples, you are part of a new people, a new kingdom, and we don't act like that around here. Then all his disciples deserted him and fled. Of course they did. Every single one of them. And I have absolutely no doubt that I would have done the same. Legged it for the hills. This was not what the disciples signed up for. It was not what they envisaged. It was scary. Whatever you make of Zahn's idea, it kind of captures that idea that for so many first century Jews, Jesus was a mystery. They were looking for something else. In our home group, we spent a couple of years reading Mark's Gospel together. Fortnight after fortnight after fortnight, we returned to Mark's Gospel. We didn't skip any of it. We read the whole thing from beginning to end. And one of the things that struck us again and again is how Jesus' followers seemed totally incapable of truly hearing Jesus. Time and time again, they got him wrong, they misunderstood him, or were left totally flummoxed. One of those things you maybe miss when you just read sections of the gospel. But when you read it all through, it leaps out at you. Becomes stark. Actually, can I recommend to you maybe as a Lent exercise, once a week, take one of the gospels and read it all the way through. Or do it in chunks over the course of the week. But read it all the way through. Like you would read a novel, don't overanalyze it. Maybe halt at things that catch your attention, but don't try too much to understand it. Just read it like a novel. Note what you notice. Just read the whole thing. There are 4 Gospels and about 6 weeks to Lent. So there's time to do all 4, actually. And if reading isn't your thing, then find an app on your phone. If you Google, for instance, David Suchet Bible Act, you'll find his reading of the whole Bible, but particularly the Gospels. Get a cup of coffee or a glass of wine if you're Rick, or sorry, others of you in the church as well, or a beer or whatever. And just read it as a whole. Let it do its work on you. Let it read you, maybe. Like us, the disciples were drawn to Jesus. They loved Jesus. They found Jesus compelling. It was exciting even. But at the end of the day, they seemed to have no idea what was going on. And at the crucial moment, they all scarper. Not one of them remains, and Jesus is left on his own to face what only he can face. Rick mentioned in his prayers that it's a confusing time in the world, and we struggle to make sense of it. And we wonder, what on earth is God doing? And how is this going to work out? And how do I react without feeling totally overwhelmed? And we see Jesus saying, put your sword down. You think, really? And we remember those words, love your enemies. They're great in theory, aren't they? It's tough when your enemy is there right in front of you and threatening you. The Sermon on the Mount is beautiful, but actually, in our daily lives, on that bit about laying aside your self-interest and taking up your cross, suddenly I start squirming in the pulpit. Like the disciples, we struggle to understand what on earth is going on. We love Jesus, and we want to follow Jesus. And it's hard. And Jesus is left all on his own by the disciples to face what only he can face. And perhaps the way it has to, that is the way it has to be. Jesus says, all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Fulfilled not in the sense that somehow the Old Testament predicts what was going to happen. The prophets are not a collection of predictions. A bit more like maybe a collection of promises. The promise that God would act and deliver his people. And the prophets are fulfilled because Jesus embodied that promise. He lived it out in himself, in his death, in his resurrection. He is truly the salvation of God. In his suffering love, in his taking on himself all the sin of the world, all the evil, he somehow neutralizes its power, its effect. It's interesting for the disciples. After Easter, everything made sense. Suddenly, the penny dropped. Suddenly, they got it. All those things that they'd struggled to understand, suddenly it made sense. Jesus doesn't make sense without the cross, without the resurrection. Don't allow Easter to go by without gazing at the foot of the cross. Try to lay aside your own theology of what the cross is all about. Just listen. Just watch. Just let the story speak to you and capture your attention and transform you. Start of the Easter, that's all I've got. So we try to make sense of the world, which feels nonsense. Just look at Jesus in the last week of his life. Look at the cross. Look at the resurrection. That's the place everything begins to make sense. Just quickly, some words from Psalm 85. Surely his salvation is near those who fear him, that his glory may dwell in our land. Love and faithfulness meet together. Righteousness and peace kiss each other. And so Jesus sets his foot to the cross, to the salvation that he will earn, sealed with a kiss. Amen. Let's just be quiet for a moment, just reflect on what you've heard.